Hi, I'm Ed Sperling. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of System Level Design. I'm here with Jim Kenney, the Director of Marketing at Mentor Graphics for Emulation. I hope that's your title.
That's it.
Okay.
Thanks, Ed.
Jim, you know, emulation has always been the kind of thing that's always been situated for the hardware guys, but the dirty secret about emulation is the software guys have always wanted to use this technology, but they've never had the budget to do it, first of all, and second of all, they've always had to steal time, almost in the old time-sharing method. What's changing there?
So what's changing now with SoCs is so much of the functionality of the SoC is implemented in software. So simply verifying the chip's hardware is really quite incomplete. There's many functions that simply can't be verified unless you can run software. So we're seeing the hardware development and verification teams basically funding the emulation for the software guys to use. So we have customers that are providing 16 and 32 seats of emulation for their software guys to debug the device drivers, to check out everything. Also does a great job of verifying the hardware.
As more things come together, as chips begin dealing with hardware and software both in the same system, we're starting to witness on many levels the breakdown of what used to be silos there, right? I mean, that's really what's going on here and what's driving some of this. So how do you, but at the same time, the software guys do use technology different than the hardware guys. What's different there? How do they approach it versus a hardware engineer?
You know, that's a very good question, because the software guys basically want the same environment they already have. They just want access to a hardware model much sooner. So in organizations where the hardware folks are inviting the software people in and encouraging them to use the emulator, the hardware team needs to provide a software tools environment that's very similar to what the software guys are using, or they simply decline. In other organizations where the emulation group is more influential, they can alter the software execution and debug environment some to better suit the emulator. For example, to support more engineers simultaneously on the emulator. So we see two camps. Use the exact same tools the software guys are already using, and also use some more efficient tools that allow more software folks to have access to the emulator.
What are they doing now that requires an emulator versus the old simulation that they used to use?
Right. So simulation is still being used for block level verification. But you really can't run much of any software in simulation. So the emulator is being used to run software. The reason it's becoming a big deal now on the emulator is that the FPGA prototypes are getting more and more complex for some of these chips. And in many cases, our emulation customers are saying the FPGA prototype is going to be 3 months later than usual in the project, and we'd really like to get debugging some software. So what's really changing is they want to start debugging software sooner, and the emulator is pretty much the first place you can go do that, unless you're able to have an FPGA prototype ready very early on.
Is it getting to the point now on complexity where you're almost going to need, we used to have simulation farms. Are we heading toward emulation farms? Is this the next phase of where we're going?
Well, yes.
Probably good for your business, but even aside from that.
It really depends on how many engineers you need to support and how many software engineers you need to support. So we have a number of customers that have 2, 3, 4 seats of emulation, and their design teams and verification teams can get by with that. We have other customers that need to provide hundreds of seats of emulation to both hardware and software folks, and that starts to look like a farm, a lab or a data center with lots of emulators lined up that have access for everyone. But it's somewhat a function of design complexity because of the amount of verification you have to do, but it's mostly a function of how big your verification team is and how big your software team is.
Is emulation being used, for a long time it was used primarily at the very complex SoCs that were going into mobile devices. Is it starting to migrate up into the enterprise now? And the reason I ask that is there's a lot more price flexibility at that market point, and also a little bit more flexibility in time to market than there is in what's going on in the mobile space.
So by enterprise level, you mean?
Server, the chips that go into the servers, that go into the storage, the networking pieces.
Yeah, in fact, traditionally, I think the very first users of emulation were the folks that were building complex processors, like the Intel processors and the AMD processors, where they really needed to verify very thoroughly these processors because of their distribution. I actually see it now moving down into the SoC and into the mobile space. Customers that have been doing simulation for years, chips finally got too complex and have to move to emulation. So mobile space is definitely a big spot for us. The large CPU manufacturers and designers is a good spot for us. Also networking companies. So
networking infrastructure is what you're talking about.
Networking infrastructure, routers, edge routers. So it's hard to pin down in terms of what market segments are using emulation. It's most of them, except maybe medical, for example, they seem to be fairly light. But mobile is a pretty big growing sector.